reckon? It's a bit windy.
Here is the place where Wilford Woodruff dedicated the surrounding area for the preaching of the gospel. 10 miles in the distance is Gadfield Elm Chapel in Worcestershire. It is the oldest LDS meeting house in the world. It was built in 1836, the same year as the Kirtland Temple. But before we get there, we need to stop at Benbows Pond. Not only a famous baptismal site, it's also located on the farm of John and Jane Benbow. You may well remember them from the British pageant. They were members of a primitive Methodist splinter group called the United Brethren, which was led by Thomas Kington. Their baptism by Wilford Woodruff in March 1840 ultimately led to him preaching amongst the members of the United Brethren. Job Smith, a 12-year-old boy who was called upon to teach, tells us about many of the United Brethren. On the 25th of December that year, Smith was ordained as a teacher, although he was only 12 years old. In an unpublished memoir, Job Smith recollected that most of the people in the branches where he taught were extremely illiterate, and many of them unable to read a hymn from the book, and no one capable of keeping a record of their council meetings. So his ability to read and write reasonably well made him popular as a clerk as well as a teacher, despite his youth. This is an illustration of the low level of education within the rural communities in the area. We also learn from Job Smith that the United Brethren had women preaching amongst their ranks. In Job Smith's reminiscences about the United Brethren, he speaks of two preachers, Thomas Steed and Susan Brooks, who were conversing together the Sunday before Wilford Woodruff's arrival. I wonder how Susan Brooks felt once she joined the Mormon Church and realised she couldn't preach anymore. I wonder how the women generally who had been preaching felt about their loss of role within the community. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.
Ultimately, the teaching efforts amongst the United Brethren were a big success.
We baptised over 1,800, including all of the United Brethren, save one. We baptised over 200 preachers of various denominations in that part of the vineyard. A synod of church ministers became so alarmed for their flocks in that part of the vineyard, they petitioned Parliament to adopt measures to stop our preaching. Despite the opposition of local preachers, all but one of the United Brethren were baptised. Almost everywhere you read about this story, in fact, they say nearly all of them were baptised or all but one were baptised.
But they never mention who that individual was and what their reasons were for not joining. But I've tracked them down.
His name was Philip Holt, and he was one of the preachers for the United Brethren. His reasons for not joining are harder to find, and try as I might, I can't find his reasons yet. Videos like this one, as you'll be able to tell by the list of sources in the description box, are very research intensive. I'm going to continue to research Philip Holt and see what I can find. And if you'd like to support that research, $10, $15, $20 a month at the donor box link in the description will help this research continue. Whatever you can afford to contribute will help me continue to do this work full time. Now, notwithstanding the reservations of Mr. Holt, nor the potential disgruntlement of women no longer allowed to preach, the conversion of the United Brethren brought not just congregations in the hundreds, but also the locations in which the group would meet. And that brings us to Gadfield Elm. When Janet Thomas brought a group of Welsh youth to the site, here's how she described it. The final stop was at the remains of Gadfield Elm Chapel. Just the rock walls stand. The roof is gone and the nettles have grown up inside. But the chapel was the first building owned by the church outside of the United States. It is easy to imagine what it must have been like 160 years ago as people walked down the winding country road to the chapel. British Mormons for generations have known of Gadfield Elm. To us it was as real and significant as the Hill Cumorah or the Kirtland Temple. It was a frequent stop on any church history tour, and yet unlike Benbows Pond, which was purchased in 1987 and dedicated by Russell M. Nelson, the church did not own the ruins of Gadfield Elm.
So how did it go from being in such a sorry state to this symbol of Mormon history that we see here today?
Did the LDS Church spend some of its vast wealth to purchase and restore the site? After all, in 2024, the church spent $192 million buying the Kirtland Temple and other historical sites. Surely they could spare the £75,000 it costs to purchase and restore Gadfield Elm.
Nope. The church weren't actually that interested in purchasing the site, but some local members definitely were.
Wayne Gardner, Bishop of the Hereford Ward, was an instrumental figure in the eventual acquisition of the chapel. He recalled that in the fall of 1994, several local members of the church became aware that the dilapidated chapel was for sale. Several of these members had contacted stake and church offices in Solihull, England, to see if the church had plans to purchase the chapel. They did not. Apparently, Gardner had not learned of the sale until 2 weeks before the auction date, which was set for October the 12th, 1994.
Wayne Gardner and several other members of the church bought the land at auction in this pub here for £20,000. Now, they'd had an agreement with a local farmer that he wouldn't outbid them and that they would sell most of the land back to him, which they did for £15,000, meaning that Gadfield Elm only cost them £5,000 to purchase. But that was still their own money, And so that they could do this in an effective way, they set up a charity.
The Gadfield Elm Charitable Trust.
By setting up the Gadfield Elm Charitable Trust, this allowed them to fundraise for the rest of the project.
With very limited resources derived entirely from contributions, these visionary souls lovingly restored the ruin stone by stone to its present state, as near as possible to how it may have been in the times of Wilford Woodruff more than 160 years ago.
Only once the members had got these walls back up, stone by stone, did the church finally get involved and make a donation to get the roof back on. Then, once the church had sourced these pews from a church in Wales and the building was complete, Geoffrey R. Holland came in 2000 and dedicated the building. The building was then handed over to the church in 2004 by the Gadfield Elm Charitable Trust.
A building the church wasn't particularly interested in saving, and that was largely saved by the hard work and funding of local members, was then just handed over to the church as a gift by those members. And yet, even as an official church historical site, it does not get the care and attention it deserves. Would any of the church's American sites be left indefinitely with peeling letters on display boards, for example? That's meant to say Thomas Kington. There is a feeling amongst some members that the site is somewhat of a charity case compared to other church sites. And I can imagine that doesn't feel great either for the members who put great personal sacrifice into restoring this building.
And of course, these members had no reason to believe that the church had billions of dollars that they could have spent funding this project, because the church had employed systematic efforts to hide the size and nature of their wealth from the public and church members. And if you want to learn more about that, click just above my head somewhere. I want to be on the other side of the frame this time.
Yeah, you're perfectly in the right place.
It's boggy.